I hope through these few slides to present something of the big picture showing how public school finance has changed over time and how it compares to other important finance measures. Public schools in New Hampshire spent $3.5 billion in the most recent school year. That is a lot of money. This pie chart shows where the money came from in the 2021 school year. The biggest portion, 61%, came from your local property taxes. Another 10% came from the statewide education property tax called SWEPT. Both are shown in dark blue because they come from the same source, although with different names. You paid both of those when you paid your property taxes. If you are a renter, your landlord paid the tax, but your rent included that, and thus in reality, you paid it. New Hampshire provided what is called adequacy aid as cash to school districts. That was 18% of total revenue. Some people seem to think that the lottery funds the schools to a large degree. We've shown in the pie that it is only 4% of the total. It is part of the adequacy aid. The state also provided other aid, such as special education and building aid, shown in light green. That amounts to another 3%. Federal aid, shown in dark purple, amounted to 7%. This chart shows how much each revenue source contributed each year from 1998 through 2021. 2000 was the first year of the implementation of the reform that followed the Claremont lawsuits. In that year, SWEPT was initiated. Note that the amount raised by property taxes in 2000, in the third bar from the left, was considerably less than in the prior year. Property taxpayers had received some relief by the reform. The dark green represents the so-called foundation aid schools had received in 1998 and 1999, and then the adequacy aid that school districts began receiving from the state beginning in 2000. Note that what has grown over the past 21 years is the local property tax. Over the 21 years, state aid has risen 62%. Property taxes to support the schools, however, have risen 158%. The state has not kept up its share of the costs of our public schools. The increased burden has fallen on property taxpayers. Property taxes to support schools have certainly risen, but so too has personal income over the past 50 years. This chart shows school property taxes as a percent of New Hampshire's aggregate personal income. The orange line shows how it fell from 3.1% of income in 1999 to 2.2% of income in 2000 when the new state cash adequacy aid was introduced. It then began to rise again, reaching a peak of 3.1% in 2009. Since then, it has been in a slow decline. In the most recent year, 2021, school property taxes were only 2.5% of personal income in New Hampshire. It has been lower in only 2 of the prior 50 years. A 2.5% tax on all personal income would raise the same amount as is currently raised by school property taxes. The amount of revenue devoted to our public schools has certainly increased considerably over time. Now I want to look at the spending side of the equation. This chart shows spending of New Hampshire's public schools from 1937 until 2021. It is a logarithmic chart, which means that each horizontal line represents 10 times the number below it. On a logarithmic chart, a number that is growing at a constant rate of compound growth is represented by a straight line. This chart shows that public school spending was growing 11.2% per year over the 47-year period from 1943 through 1990. The rate of growth of annual growth then subsided to 5.5% through 2009. More recently, over the past 12 years, the compound rate of growth has been only 2.2%. I know that many people today complain about the year-to-year budget increases at school district meetings. What would they think if they were faced with annual increases of 11% each year, year after year, when their grandparents and parents were in school? This chart shows spending on our public schools as a percent of New Hampshire's gross domestic product. Over the most recent 50 years, it's varied from a high of just below 5% to a low of just over 3%. For most of the time, it has been in the 3.5% to 4.5% range. Currently, it is 4%. The chart also shows national public school spending as a percent of national gross domestic product. Spending for public schools nationally has generally been between 3.5% and 4.5%. New Hampshire has been below the national average more often than not. As a percentage of economic activity, public schools are currently at about the average of the past 50 years, 4%. Some people want to compare school spending to the Consumer Price Index, CPI. This chart shows the CPIU, that is for all urban consumers, from 1972, when it was 41.8, to 2021, when it was 271. That is nearly 6.5 times what it was 50 years ago. Most certainly a large increase. During the same 50 years, New Hampshire school district spending increased from $160 million to $3.5 billion. That's 21 times what it was, much larger than the growth in the CPI. Why is that? There are multiple reasons, but one stands out. Among other things, CPI measures what consumers spend money on, not what schools spend money on. The CPI bears no relationship to school spending. This slide shows some of the things whose prices are tracked to create the Consumer Price Index. It shows the percentage of the total CPI market basket that is attributed to certain spending categories. 32% of the CPI is what consumers spend on housing. 5% is restaurant meals. If this is how schools spent their money, then a comparison to CPI might be somewhat useful. Schools tend not to buy pet collars, sports bras, men's suits, bedroom furniture, jewels, or distilled spirits, nor do they pay for care of invalids at home. All of those are part of the CPI. How much the prices changed or didn't change for most items in the CPI is irrelevant to school budgets and spending. I hope I've been able to provide you some important big picture context for discussions of public school spending and revenue in New Hampshire.